Then he opened a channel to his fleet and issued an order that no fleet marshal of the Drath Dominion had ever issued in 400 years of conquest. He ordered a withdrawal. Act V. Resolution. What the galaxy learned. The withdrawal was not announced. It was not explained. The Drath fleet simply stopped pressing. It pulled back, slowly at first, then with increasing speed, and within 3 hours had transitioned out of the Karath-Sol system entirely. The silence it left behind was extraordinary. Fleet Commander Sareth stood on the bridge of the pale horizon and watched the Drath signatures vanish from her display, one after another, until the tactical screen showed nothing where an armada had been. She did not cheer. She did not weep. She simply stood there, very still, for a long moment. Then she opened a channel to the Unbroken Covenant. "Captain Osei," she said. "Fleet Commander," came the reply. Adira's voice was tired now. Genuinely, deeply tired. But there was something underneath the exhaustion that Sareth couldn't quite name. Something that didn't sound like relief. It sounded like she had simply done what she came to do, and now she was ready to rest. "The evacuation reached 97%, Sareth said. "I know. Your passenger liner. The Meridian Sun is intact. Wanjika's crew has 4 injured. None critical. The hull breach has been patched. She's already asking when she can make another run." Sareth made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob, but occupied the space between them. "Why?" she said after a moment. "You had no obligation. No treaty required this. The Drath are not your enemy. You had no strategic reason to come." There was a pause on the human end of the channel. Not the pause of someone searching for an answer, the pause of someone deciding how to explain something that, to them, required no explanation. "They were hurting people," Adira said at last. "And we could try to help. That's it. That's the whole calculation." "That's not a military doctrine," Sareth said. "No," Adira agreed quietly. "It's not." In the days that followed, as the human ships began the long process of repairs and the Velhari began to assess what had survived of their system, scholars and analysts from a dozen species began to examine what had happened at Karath-Sol. They ran their own calculations. They modeled the battle. They studied the decisions made by individual human captains, the warship commanders who had taken calculated risks with their own hulls to shield other vessels, the freighter pilots who had made attack runs in ships never designed for combat, the doctor who had parked a passenger liner in a kill zone and calmly talked evacuation transports to safety. The analysis that came back was consistent across all species, across all methodologies. None of it made sense. By any rational model, the humans should not have come. The ones who came should not have fought the way they did. The ones who fought should have preserved their own vessels over the strategic objectives. Every choice they made, examined in isolation, appeared to violate basic survival logic. And yet the outcome, the system held, the civilians evacuated, the Drath withdrawn, was undeniably real. A Velhari philosopher named Death Era, working in the weeks after the battle, wrote what became perhaps the most widely translated essay in the Amber Reach's intellectual history. It was titled simply On the Humans. In it, she proposed that what she had witnessed at Karath-Sol was not a military tactic or a political strategy. It was something older, something that went back, she suspected, to the very earliest days of the human species. Back to when they were small and fragile and living in a world full of things that could kill them, and they had discovered that the only way to survive was to choose each other. Not because it was logical, not because the math worked out, but because something in them, something woven into the deepest structure of what they were, could not do otherwise. They call it many things, she wrote. Compassion, solidarity, brotherhood, love. But underneath all the names, it is always the same thing. A refusal to look at suffering and simply walk away. A compulsion as ancient as their species, to reach toward the thing that is hurt and try to help it. Not because they will benefit, not because they are ordered to, but because they are human, and this is what humans do. We have spent centuries classifying species, cataloging their technologies, their politics, their war-making capacities. We have rated them by strength and speed and intelligence and firepower. And in all of this cataloging, I wonder if we have missed the one thing that actually matters, the one variable that no survey has ever properly measured. The humans came when they were called. They came with warships and freighters and research vessels and passenger liners. They came with weapons and medical equipment and improvised targeting systems and a single doctor who had no weapons at all and still placed herself between the danger and the people who needed to escape it. The Drath have conquered 19 civilizations. They have never met anything like this. And I genuinely believe that when Karath-Sol ordered his withdrawal, it was not because he had run the numbers and decided the cost was too high. It was because, for the first time in 400 years of conquest, he looked at what he was fighting and felt something he had no framework for. He felt afraid, not of human weapons, not of human ships, but of human will, the implacable, irrational, magnificent refusal to be stopped by odds that should have stopped them. The willingness to send a passenger liner into a kill zone and keep the channel open while the hull was being hit, because someone on the other end needed to hear a calm voice telling them which way to go. You cannot defeat that, and I think perhaps that Karath-Sol understood this. I think he looked at his numbers and his models and his 19 conquests, and he understood for the first time that he had found a variable he did not know how to factor. A variable that made all his other calculations unreliable. He had found a people who would rather die doing the right thing than live doing the wrong one. And he decided not to find out what happened when you pushed people like that all the way to the edge. The essay was read across the Amber Reach and beyond. It was translated into the Drath Dominion's primary language and distributed, not by human diplomats, but by Drath scholars who had gotten hold of a copy and couldn't stop sharing it. Karath-Sol allegedly read it 3 times. He never commented on it publicly. But he never returned to Karath-Sol. 18 months after the battle, Fleet Commander Sarath Velen traveled to the human system of Sol to represent the Amber Reach at a diplomatic summit. She had been asked to give a speech. She had prepared a careful, measured address about mutual defense pacts and strategic cooperation and the benefits of a formal alliance. When she stood at the podium and looked out at the gathered human delegation, at Adira Osei, sitting in the second row with her uniform still bearing the patch she'd worn at Karath-Sol, at Commander Backer beside her, already in conversation with 2 Velhari military attachés, at Dr. Wanjiku Mathoni, who had somehow ended up on the diplomatic delegation and was currently teaching a Velhari child how to fold a paper crane. Sarath looked down at her prepared remarks, and then she set them aside. "I had a speech," she said. "It was very good. It had 17 data points and 4 historical precedents and a compelling argument for mutual strategic benefit." She paused. "I'm not going to give it." The room was quiet. "I was on the pale horizon," she said. "When your ships came out of the void, I had been awake for 38 hours. I had spent most of them trying to calculate how many of my people I was going to lose. And then something appeared on my sensors that I did not have a category for. Not a fleet. Not a formation, just people. People who had received a signal and come anyway. People who had decided, each of them individually, that what was happening was wrong and that they had the means to try to make it right." She was quiet for a moment. "I do not know what to offer you in return for that," she said. "I do not think there is a sufficient diplomatic currency. I can offer alliance, and we do. I can offer gratitude, and we do. But what I really want to say, what I crossed the void to say, is that I understand, now, something I did not understand before. You are strange," she said. "You are loud and unpredictable, and you make decisions that do not calculate correctly, and you bring passenger liners to battle zones. You are not, by any measure I was trained to use, the most powerful species in this region of space. But you are something rarer than powerful," she said. "You are good, not perfectly good. Not good in the easy circumstances. Good when it costs something. Good when the math is against you. Good when there is no particular reason to be good except that it is the right thing, and being the right thing is apparently reason enough. The galaxy has a lot of powerful species," she said. "It has very few good ones. We are honored to count ourselves your allies, and we are more honored still to count ourselves, perhaps, your friends." The applause that followed was, by all accounts, somewhat chaotic. partly because the Velhari delegation began it and then the humans joined in, and the two species had entirely different clapping rhythms, which resulted in a noise that was less dignified and more joyful than most diplomatic summits produced. Dr. Wanjiku Muthoni, in the third row, finished her paper crane and handed it to the Velhari child, who turned it over in their long fingers with an expression of baffled delight. And for the first time, the galaxy understood what it truly meant to be human. Not the weapons we build, not the fleets we field, not the calculations we run or the strategies we plan, but the stubborn, ancient, irrational, glorious conviction that when someone sends a signal into the dark, a signal that says simply, "We are in trouble and we are afraid," the correct answer is not a committee. The correct answer is, "I'm going. Anyone coming?" About your Western corridor, specifically about how we might use it to our advantage. Are you available to talk tactics? Sarath stared at the speaker for a long moment. "You're one ship," she said. "At the moment," Adira said. There was the briefest pause. "But I'm not the only one who saw your signal." On the Drath command ship, Velhari received word of the incoming human vessel with mild curiosity and no alarm. One ship, mid-tier technology. He dispatched a standard intercept patrol, 12 vessels, more than adequate, and returned to his dinner. He did not know yet what was coming behind the unbroken covenant. None of them did, because while Captain Osei had been making maximum burn toward Karath-Sol, her message had been received. And humanity, volatile, unpredictable, emotionally driven humanity, had responded. Not with authorization forms, not with committee deliberations, not with careful cost-benefit analyses about the strategic value of intervention. They had responded the way humans always respond when someone sends a message into the dark that simply says, "I'm going. Anyone coming?" They had come. Act 4, Climax. Something roars from the void. The transit signature appeared on Drath sensors at 0347, ship standard time, and it was wrong. Not wrong in a malfunctioning equipment sense. Wrong in a "this does not match any model" sense. The Drath sensor officer, a meticulous being named Vel-Sorak, ran the reading 3 times and got the same result each time. She flagged it for her superior. Her superior flagged it for the Fleet Marshal's aide. The Fleet Marshal's aide woke Veth from his rest cycle with the particular tone of voice that indicated something had gone outside the expected. Veth looked at the sensor data. Then he looked at it again. "How many?" he said quietly. "Still counting, Fleet Marshal. The transit signatures they're staggered, coming in waves." "From where?" "Multiple vectors. The human ship Unbroken Covenant appears to have served as a navigation beacon. The others followed her transit corridor." Veth was quiet for a moment. "What others?" he said. "What others followed her?" The answer came not from his sensor officer, but from the main display, which suddenly lit up with 47 new contact signatures, and then 60, and then 83, arriving in a rolling cascade as if the void itself was exhaling something vast and furious and entirely, absolutely human. They were not all the same class. That was the first thing that struck every Drath observer who would later describe the moment. They had expected, if they had expected anything at all, a military formation. Uniform vessels. Disciplined columns. What arrived was everything. There were warships, proper warships, heavy cruisers and destroyers with weapons arrays that the Drath recognized as genuinely capable. But there were also converted freighters with weapons mounts that had clearly been installed in transit, panels still unpainted, cables still exposed. There was a research vessel, running with its science bay repurposed into a makeshift fire control center. There was a passenger liner, of all things, its civilian. They were not organized in any formation that Drath tactical doctrine recognized. They moved in loose clusters, communicating rapidly, adjusting dynamically, not following a pre-planned strategy but improvising one, in real time, under fire, with a speed and flexibility that made Veth's carefully calculated predictive models begin to silently disintegrate. And leading them, threading ahead of the pack like a needle pulling a thread through darkness, was the Unbroken Covenant. Captain Adira Osei did not announce her presence dramatically. She did not broadcast a warning or a declaration. She simply opened a direct channel to Fleet Commander Sarath and said, "We're here. What do you need?" Sarath, who had been awake for 38 hours and had spent most of them doing precise, painful calculations about how many people she was going to lose. "How many of you are there?" she said. "Still coming in," Adira said. "Last I checked, 91. But we've got more in the pipe." 91, Sarath repeated, and then, voice barely above a whisper, "You brought 91 ships." "I sent a message," Adira said simply. "They made their own choices." The battle that followed lasted 11 hours. It was not a clean battle. It was not elegant. The human formation, if you could call it a formation, refused to fight the way the Drath expected. They did not form defensive lines. They did not hold positions. They moved, constantly, fluidly, using the planet's gravity well and the debris fields from the previous 6 days of fighting as cover and as weapon in equal measure. The converted freighters would draw fire, then scatter. The warships would hit the pursuers while they were extended and off balance. The research vessel would pop up from behind a debris cluster and deliver targeting data that allowed 3 different human ships to concentrate fire on a single Drath vessel in the same instant. It was chaotic. It was improvised. By every standard Drath tactical metric, it should not have worked. But humans, Gorveth was slowly learning, did not fight by Drath tactical metrics. They fought by something older and stranger and far harder to calculate. The desperate, furious, compassionate refusal to let the thing in front of them go wrong. At the 4th hour of the battle, the passenger liner Meridian Sun, which had no weapons, no shields beyond its civilian-grade hull plating, and no business being anywhere near a combat zone, moved into the evacuation corridor and held position there, broadcasting medical emergency signals on every frequency, taking fire that had been intended for the last 3 Velhari evacuation transports. Her captain, a 53-year-old Kenyan woman named Dr. Wanjiku Muthoni, who had been a trauma surgeon before she had been a ship captain, kept the channel open the entire time, calmly directing the evacuation transports around her, giving them vector adjustments, keeping her voice entirely steady even as the hull rang with impacts and 3 of her crew were hurt and her own hands were bleeding from where she'd grabbed a console that had just discharged. "Keep moving," she told the transports. "Don't stop for us. Keep moving." The last transport made it through. The Meridian Sun limped out of the corridor on one engine, trailing atmosphere from a hull breach, and was immediately surrounded by 3 human warships who formed up on her flanks and escorted her, slowly, carefully, out of the combat zone. Gorveth Kral watched all of this from his command ship. He had, in his long career, encountered many species in combat. He had faced the Velhari, whose warriors underwent decade-long combat conditioning. He had faced the Horthak collectives, who coordinated with a telepathic precision that no individual species could match. He had faced the Dren, who built weapon systems of such sophistication that they could punch through most shields in a single volley. He had never faced anything quite like this, because the Velhari fought with discipline, the Horthak fought with unity, the Dren fought with technology, the humans fought with feeling. They were angry, they were frightened, they were, some of them, probably terrified, and yet they kept moving forward, not because they had been ordered to, not because their strategic doctrine required it, but because somewhere in the deep architecture of what they were, they had decided that the thing happening to the Velhari should not be allowed to happen. And that decision, once made, was apparently not subject to revision based on incoming weapons fire. At the 9th hour of the battle, Gorveth made his own calculation. He had lost 37 ships. He had damaged or destroyed the human formation's fighting capacity by perhaps 30%. He had failed to intercept the final evacuation transports. The planetary surface was now, by all reports, approximately 94% evacuated, and the remaining 6% were being lifted out even now, under fire, by human shuttles that were making runs so aggressive and so exposed that his interceptors couldn't lock on without risking friendly fire on their own craft. He ran the numbers. He ran them again. He ran them a 3rd time. Every calculation said the same thing. If he continued this engagement, he would win. Eventually, he had the numbers. He had the firepower. He would grind through the human formation and the Velhari remnants and take the system. And then he asked himself a question he had never had reason to ask before in 19 conquests. At what cost? Not a financial cost, not a material cost, those he had always been willing to pay. But what was the cost of a species knowing that the humans were out there? A species that sent civilian liners into combat zones, that converted research ships into warships in transit, that responded to a single message in the dark with 91 ships because someone said, "I'm going." Anyone coming? What was the cost of making those beings an enemy? What was the cost, not of this battle, but of everything that came after it? Galactic sat in his command chair for a long time. Space, they say, is indifferent. It does not care who wins. It does not mourn who dies. It simply continues, vast, ancient, and coldly silent, while the small bright sparks of civilization flicker and burn and sometimes go dark forever. The Velhari had always known this. As a species over 11,000 years old, they had watched enough civilizations crumble to understand that the universe did not intervene. It did not send heroes. It did not answer prayers broadcast into the dark. And yet, on the 7th day of the siege of Karath-Sol, something came roaring out of the void that the Velhari had never seen before. Something that defied every calculation they had made, every model of warfare they had constructed across millennia. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. To understand what happened above Karath-Sol, you first need to understand what Karath-Sol was, and what it meant to lose it. The Velhari homeworld sat at the edge of the Amber Reach, a cluster of 47 inhabited star systems strung together like lantern light across 30 light-years of space. Karath-Sol was not the largest of those systems. It was not the wealthiest. It was not even the most populated. But it was the hinge, the gravitational, logistical, and emotional center upon which the entire Reach pivoted. Lose Karath-Sol, and the Amber Reach didn't just suffer. Fractured. Supply lines collapsed. Defense corridors opened. The remaining systems became isolated pockets, easy prey for whatever came next. And what was coming was the Drath Dominion. The Drath were not, by any stretch, a young or unsophisticated species. They were conquerors, methodical, patient, brilliant in the way that apex predators are brilliant. Not creative, but terrifyingly efficient. They had absorbed 19 civilizations in 400 years. Not destroyed them, no. The Drath were not wasteful. They consumed. They dismantled the conquered culture piece by piece, repurposed its infrastructure, absorbed its survivors into labor tiers, and moved on to the next target with the calm momentum of a glacier. The Velhari had been on their list for 60 years. Fleet Commander Sarath Vln stood on the observation deck of the defense platform Ethon's Crown and watched the Drath armada assemble on her long-range sensors. She was tall even by Velhari standards, long-limbed, pale-skinned, with the deep violet eyes that marked the elder bloodlines of her species. She had commanded naval forces for 31 years. She had won battles that textbooks now described as miracles. She did not feel like a miracle worker today. "Fleet Commander," said her tactical officer, a younger Velhari named Dav, his voice carefully controlled. "Latest count puts the Drath at 214 warships. Another 40 still emerging from transit." Sarath said nothing. She watched the red indicators multiply on the display like drops of blood spreading across a pale cloth. "Our interceptors are in position," Dav continued. "Ground batteries are charged." "How long for the remaining 37%? She asked. "At current capacity, 19 hours. "And how long before the Drath are in firing range?" Silence. 8 hours, Dav said quietly. Sarath closed her eyes for 3 seconds, the Velhari gesture of accepting an unpleasant truth, and then opened them again. "Then we hold for 8 hours, she said. "And then we hold some more." Across the system, the defenders of Karath-Sol prepared to die. The Drath Dominion's Supreme Fleet Marshal, a towering being named Galactic, was not a cruel leader by Drath standards. He simply did not think in terms of cruelty. He thought in terms of calculus. The Velhari defense of Karath-Sol was, in his estimation, a predictable set of variables. He had absorbed their military doctrine, studied their technology ratings, cross-referenced their fleet losses over the past 6 years of the campaign. He had run the numbers through 3 separate predictive engines. All 3 agreed. The Velhari would resist for approximately 10 to 14 hours before cohesion collapsed. Then the Dominion would move in, secure the orbital platforms, and begin the intake process. Simple, efficient, expected. What Gorveth had not planned for, what none of the Drath had planned for, was the variable that had been slowly growing stranger and more unpredictable on the galactic stage for the past 70 years. Humanity. The humans had arrived in the Amber Reach only 14 years ago. A small delegation, initially scientific observers, trade envoys, the kind of tentative first contact that was so common it barely warranted documentation in the Dominion's records. The Velhari had welcomed them with cautious warmth. The humans had responded with characteristic enthusiasm. They set up an embassy, opened 4 trade routes, began learning the Velhari language with almost aggressive speed. The Drath had assessed humanity in the Dominion's standard intake survey. The report described them as biologically resilient, technologically mid-tier, emotionally volatile, strategically unpredictable, not a military priority. That assessment was 14 years old. It was also catastrophically wrong. The Amber Reach had sent a distress signal to every allied system when the Drath siege began. Most responded with sympathy. Several sent supplies. The humans had sent Captain Adira Osei and the UES Unbroken Covenant. She received the signal on the 4th day of the siege, when the Velhari outer defense line had already been pushed back 40,000 kilometers and the evacuation was stalling under Drath interdiction fire. The Unbroken Covenant was not the closest human vessel. It was not the largest. It was not, by any objective measure, the most powerful ship that humanity could have sent. But it was the one whose captain looked at that distress signal, looked at it with those deep brown eyes and that utterly human capacity for indignation at injustice, and said 4 words that changed everything. Set course. Maximum burn. Her executive officer, Commander Pete Backer, had been in the middle of a briefing. He paused mid-sentence and looked at her. Captain, we haven't received authorization from. Requested in transit, Commander. The Drath force is over 200 ships. We are 1. I'm aware of the math. Then perhaps. Pete. She looked at him, not commanding, not coldly, just looking at him the way that humans look at each other when they are asking a question that goes beyond rank. They've got civilians who aren't off the planet yet. Kids, families, and the defense line is cracking. Backer held her gaze for 3 seconds. Then he sat down and began calculating the fastest possible transit vector to Karath-Sol. In the meantime, Adira Osei opened a channel to every human vessel within 12 light hours and sent a single compressed message packet. It contained the Velhari distress signal, the tactical situation summary, and 1 sentence of her own composition. I'm going. Anyone coming? She did not know what would happen. She did not know if it would be enough. She knew only that something was happening that should not be allowed to happen, and that she had the means, perhaps inadequate means, but means nonetheless, to try to stop it. This is, perhaps, the most human thing there is. By the 6th day of the siege, the Velhari defense was operating on willpower and mechanical ingenuity. Their interceptor wings had been reduced from 240 craft to 61. The defense platform Ethon's Crown had taken 3 direct hits and lost her forward shield generators entirely. Fleet Commander Sereth had moved her flag to the smaller cruiser Pale Horizon, which was itself running on backup power. The Drath were in no hurry. They had the numbers. They had the time. They applied pressure with the systematic patience of a species that had done this 19 times before. Every few hours they would advance another few thousand kilometers, test the defense response, pull back slightly, and let the exhaustion compound. They were not trying to break the Velhari fleet in one blow. They were wearing it down, grinding it into dust, 1 sleepless shift at a time. Sereth had not slept in 31 hours. She stood at the tactical display and watched the evacuation counter with the focused desperation of someone trying to will a number to change faster than physics allowed. 68%. 69. The Drath had begun targeting the evacuation corridors more aggressively in the past 4 hours. Every transport that got through felt like a personal victory. Every one that didn't felt like something she would carry for the rest of her life, however long that turned out to be. Fleet Commander. Dav's voice came through the comm channel, and something in it made her hands go still on the railing. We're receiving an incoming signal. Unknown profile. It's not Drath. Put it on speaker. The voice that came through was warm and low and entirely unhurried. The voice of someone who had decided on a course of action and was now simply executing it with calm, focused precision. Fleet Commander Vielen, this is Captain Adira Osei of the United Earthship Unbroken Covenant. I'm approximately 40 minutes from your outer perimeter. I'm reading your defense disposition and I have some thoughts.